So my name is Kenya Ajikun Bradshaw. I'm currently Vice President at TNTP and excited to serve as moderator around this wonderful discussion. In most of our hopes, we actually would hope that we don't have to make any cuts to districts across the country and that we have enough resources for all of our districts and all of our schools. But I'm also a Girl Scout at heart, and our motto is be prepared. And so what we're going to do today is have a conversation on how do we make sure that all of us are prepared to be able to think about if we have to find resources or cut funding, how do we do it in a way that is authentic to supporting our community and our children's best needs, that does it in an equitable and responsible process, and how do we think about how we're making the greatest impact on supporting students. And I'm really excited to have the esteemed panelists with us today to be able to share their thoughts. So how we're going to format the conversation this afternoon is I'm going to do an introduction of our panelists and tell you who they are. Then we're going to go into, I would say, a fireside chat. I'm located in Memphis and it's 21 degrees, and we, because of the beauty of Zoom, get to be in our house. So you all should get comfortable, get a cup of water, and be able to engage with us in just a really robust conversation. And then the most important part for me is for us to hear from you all and get questions to make sure that we're being responsive to the needs and the questions that you have in each of your communities. On our panel today, we have our state superintendent of Ohio. We just talked about, so the tech problems is part of mine. So Mr. Paolo DeMaria, who is the state superintendent of public instruction in Ohio, Matthew Joseph, who is the policy director and focuses on education funding for ExcelinEd, Nate Levenson, who is the managing director on District Management Council, and Ms. Emily Schultz, who is the director of state advocacy and policy at NAPCE. As we start our first question, I'll turn it to you, to Mr. Paolo. Ohio has really been leading our country in thinking about how do you think about budgets and what do you do in preparing for a budget reduction. So can you tell us a little bit about what has Ohio's approach been and how are you thinking about sharing the information with both your state and your communities around the upcoming state budget session?
Sure, Kenya, thanks a lot. And by the way, I am also a former Girl Scout leader and a Girl Scout leader trainer, and I have just such great admiration for the Girl Scout organization. So let's start with, I don't know how much of a leader Ohio is, but I think one of the advantages I have is I come to the position with 30 years of state government experience, including a period of time as state budget director, and I've seen previous recessions where there have been reductions. And one of the things we at the department do is we serve as a resource to our state budget office as well as to the governor's office. And what we did early on, when we knew that there was going to be challenges for the last fiscal year's budget, we basically, talked through all the options. Option A, a lot of people go to, well, we have to cut the budget by a certain percentage, so we should just cut a certain percentage on all the districts of the state amount of support. And we would describe what are the pros and cons of doing that. And again, there's a certain simplicity to it, a certain elegance. But the con is that if you get a lot of money from the state, Ohio has a foundation system that distributes more money to districts that have less ability to raise their own money. So there's some districts might get 95% of their money from the state. Other districts might only get 5% of their money from the state. And so to use an across the board percentage cut, it's really a problem because you're taking more money from those who have, in some ways, the least capacity and rely the most on state funding. The next iteration is really to say, okay, well, something fair might be do it per pupil, take the same amount per pupil across the system, right? That's fair. And again, it does have a certain elegance to it. It has a certain simplicity to it. But once again, those who might be better, more wealthier and actually be spending a lot more per student feel actually a lesser reduction than those who might be spending less. And so, the third option is really taking an equalized approach, target a certain amount of money on a statewide basis per pupil, but then adjust that by some wealth factor, some equalization factor. And in Ohio, we have what's called the state share index, which is a number that is used in our regular formula that again, demonstrates for each district whether they are getting 95% of their money from the state or 5% of their money from the state. And we use the inverse of that to drive our reductions, which ended up resulting in, somewhat higher cuts in terms of from both a percentage and a per pupil basis to wealthier districts who actually got a smaller amount of money from the state. So the overall impact on their budgets was not as challenging, and yet it was much more considerate of lower wealth districts. We also employed a number of tactics to sort of squeeze that range so that, if the high end cuts were too big, we could bring those down a little bit and compensate by upping the lower end a little bit. We also were very cognizant of the fact that since charter schools don't have any alternative funding streams, they too were considered to be at that low end where they really they didn't have local resources to use, and so we applied the reductions to that end. And by and large, it was pretty well received. Nobody likes cuts, but I think people understood the fairness that we were trying to get at.
Paolo, I think you highlight one of the key pieces around being prepared and being able to share options early so that your districts can be able to be as thoughtful about their decisions as possible. Matthew, in the work that ExcelinEd has done around developing principles that ground us around this work, what are your thoughts around that? And what was the purpose of this? And how would you want to see states and districts using this work?
Well, thank you. And first, let me say, Kenya, what a privilege it is to be with you and this whole panel of people who are respected for their leadership nationally. As to the principles, ExcelinEd and various partners, we wanted to provide high-level guidance to state policymakers on how, if they have no choice but to make K-12 funding cuts over the next year or so, they can do so in a way that minimizes harm to students. We were concerned that during the Great Recession about 10 years ago, states made some mistakes that magnified harm to students. And this time we want states to be more prepared and more thoughtful. If there's a chance that a hurricane, a Category 5 hurricane is coming your way, you prepare for the worst, even if it's not certain to happen. And so we co-developed 10 principles working with a diverse group of some of the most prominent education organizations in the country and consulted with other top national experts. And we can put a link to the principles in the chat. The first principle is don't cut unless you have to. I mean, K-12 is one of the most important functions that any state has. So definitely we want states to avoid cuts unless they're absolutely necessary. But if they have to make cuts, we want them to be equitable, student-centered, and strategic. And equitable means protecting vulnerable students, just like what State Superintendent DeMaria described for Ohio. That's a great model. Student-centered means increasing the flexibility for districts and schools so that they can spend the reduced resources they have as effectively as possible. Strategic means, cut the least effective programs and protect the programs that are most important and effective for a state. And the principles also show how states can encourage districts to do the same thing when they pass on their cuts down to the school. And finally, they ask states to be transparent as possible and involve key stakeholders as soon as they can. So the bottom line of the principles is to be thoughtful and prepared in order to minimize harm to students.
Matthew, thanks so much for that. In the process of really being thoughtful and thinking about how can we minimize harm, Nate, what should we be thinking about telling states if they are in a position where they can't provide more funding to their districts? What do they need to do, and how should they be allocating the resources that they have most effectively? Mr. Levenson, that's to you.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So I think, this is kind of putting on my former superintendent hat and former school board hat, is if we can't have as much money as we'd like, the next best thing is flexibility on how to spend that money. Try to make every dollar as impactful as possible. And then I think there are two different approaches from if you're a state leader, a state policymaker, of how you can help or hurt on that flexibility, particularly during times of less money. The first is let's acknowledge that there are, in fact, flexibilities in how dollars can be spent. That could be Title I, IDA money, Title II money. And the good news is there is some flexibility there, but the bad news is in almost every state, districts don't take full advantage of that flexibility because they fear that the states will bop them over the head. So this fear of making a mistake undermines flexibilities that are already there. And so a couple very concrete things states can do is, one, to take a hard look at the guidance they're giving, approach this with some skepticism, and don't say, oh, I'm sure everybody knows we're very flexible, because that's not what most people believe. And in some cases, states have actually put additional restrictions on that go beyond what the feds have put on. And I don't think you should be doing that in this time. So the other thing you can do is, for example, is to pre-approve certain uses of, say, Title I or IDA funds for some of the best practices around remediation and intervention, since there's so much of that we're going to want to do next year. Point one is make sure that all the flexibilities that do exist are fully utilized, and acknowledge that very often states unintentionally make that not happen. Then the second thing, as powerful, is, given that this is a once in a lifetime calamity, is to bring about some at least temporary additional flexibilities. And I think there are two in particular. Many states have staffing requirement guidelines. One guidance counselor for every 300 students, one school psychologist for every 1,200 kids. Maybe it's a speech and language requirement. And all of those are really well-intentioned. But for the world we're going to be in next year and the year after, maybe I want more social workers and fewer school psychologists. Maybe I want more reading teachers and fewer speech therapists. Giving districts the ability to staff as they see fit could really be helpful. And I would put class size caps in that same category. That is a requirement to staff, perhaps not the way that districts would think is most powerful. And then I think the last piece is perhaps temporarily relaxing some of the pension rules for hiring formerly retired staff, particularly in either hard to fill positions like special educators and math teachers, but especially there is a lot of interest in having an army of highly skilled tutors and interventionists, because we got so many kids, millions and millions and millions of kids who need intervention this year, next year, and the year after. And perhaps the single best pool for these interventionists will be retired teachers. And in some states, it's kind of hard to come back. So more flexibility than we currently have, at least on a temporary basis. Plus the flexibilities we do have make them more easily accessible. Not as good as more money, but the next best thing.
Nothing is as good as more money. So that's the answer to, if we can get that would help us all out. Emily, Nathan talked a little bit around just some of the challenges that we anticipate coming forward. And one of the key ones is around our per pupil allocations, and thinking about in districts across the country. I read a report yesterday that we're missing about 1/4 of our students. In most districts, they're having about 10 to 15% of our students not in place right now. And so when we're thinking about the peer pupil allocation process, charters tend to be leaders in helping to think about what should we be doing. And so can you tell us a little bit around how has COVID really impacted our charters around their peer pupil education, and what we should be thinking about, to Paolo's earlier point when he gave differentiated options and thought about where individual groups were, thinking specifically about those who don't have extra resources or don't have the flexibility. What should we be thinking about in particular for our charter support going forward?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in addition to charters kind of navigating the budget context, just like everyone else, with the kind of constantly fluctuating revenue projections, which makes it difficult to plan, really uncertainty around relief packages and what's coming when, declining local revenue. So charters had a couple of unique challenges that they were navigating in this context. So a number of states, kind of as a stopgap solution, level funded their education budgets in FY21. So meaning that they guaranteed districts and charters the same number of dollars that they got in the fiscal year 20. So this creates a challenge for charters that are in the midst of approved or anticipated growth. So if you're a charter school that opened last year, K through 2, and just as a number, you receive $100 to serve those kids in fiscal year 20, but you're planning and you've been approved to grow by your authorizer, you're planning on adding a 3rd grade, you'll still get $100 to serve that K3 school. You've been planning to grow, you've been hiring to grow, you've been enrolling kids, all with the understanding that you'll receive funding for those students. And so this required a lot of state charter sectors to really organize quickly to help policymakers understand that unique challenge that charters have. There's movement across districts and across public schools, but these charters that had this like very planned and discrete growth in terms of grade levels, that was a really unique challenge they faced and are facing. And the second issue is really born of kind of pre-pandemic conditions, and that's that charters receive on average about 80% of what district schools receive in public funding, and they make up that gap with fundraising to pay for things like facilities. And guess what's really hard in the middle of a global pandemic? Fundraising. So it's just you're compounding that with the fact that charter schools disproportionately serve those kids who are being impacted by COVID-19 the most. And so the benefit, and just to, what everyone has said, is that charters are nimble and that they have that flexibility already. They can move money into buckets a little more with some more flexibility. But when they're already working with a lower amount, they don't have different district infrastructure to kind of point at the problem. It's a significant challenge. Charters and public schools across the board have really risen to the occasion. They have gotten very creative in meeting the needs of their communities and their students. And I think charters and public schools across the board really deserve a lot of credit for that.
Thank you, Emily. We're going to open it up to Q&A after just one more round of questions from the panelists. So I want to make sure that you post your questions in the chat so we can answer them. Paolo, can I ask you a question around building on Emily's point of how are we to be thinking about who should we be worried about the most in our district processes and thinking about funding? Like when you think about like, where are you concerned and how should we be helping districts in preparing for the most upcoming budget cycle, and who should we be making sure that we target?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, and I think the other presenters have hit the nail on the head. Is it really speaks to vulnerability. Who are the most vulnerable of our students? And recognizing to a certain extent that there may be a required additional investment to reach those vulnerable students. The most obvious example of that is really on some of the connectivity and device issues we've seen in terms of this shift to remote. People have risen to the occasion in very amazing and outstanding ways to deliver educational services remotely. But there are some just sheer barriers that have to be dealt with. Everything from the Appalachian parts of Ohio, where you just simply don't have broadband and you don't have very good cell service. So, it's almost impossible to even conceive of buying yourself out of the lack of connectivity. And so you have to resort to, can you deploy one-to-one devices and then use flash drives, use other ways to maybe technology enhance the educational experience? Otherwise you're just, left to sort of using paper and other kinds of resources. So, but that takes some work to it. And then you've got a different problem in the urban areas where you might actually have really great broadband, but it's just not accessible. It's not in the household. Students don't have the right devices. They're competing with other family members around use of those devices. And so we've seen districts be very creative. In fact, the state put $50 million in a sort of a connectivity grant enhancement program. And districts are buying hotspots. They're deploying buses to provide internet in areas. And that there are all additional costs there that relate to that vulnerable population that are challenging to engage and make sure they're staying attentive to the educational experience that the system's trying to deliver. The same is true with students with disabilities, another very vulnerable population where states and districts were challenged with staying true to the individualized education programs that have been developed, the IEPs that are developed for students with disabilities, but in a context where face-to-face interactions were proving to be very challenging. And so what did that require? People used a lot of telehealth options when that was possible. People might have been deployed to visit homes and things like that, but again, additional investments were required. So it's those kinds of things that I think we have to really understand and accommodate as best we can in the context of how we allocate resources.
Thank you, Paolo. Mr. Levenson, can I ask, is it possible to cut and innovate at the same time? And if so, like, what are ways that you think that that's possible for us to be thinking about with states?
Great question. And I think some would say that, oddly enough, that a crisis like this is not only the best time to innovate, but perhaps the easiest time. And I think there are always two challenges to innovation in K-12. The first is you need to have a really new idea. But the second is you need people to allow you to do it. And often, K-12 is not the most comfortable with change, and I understand that. But this is an opportunity because I think two things are going to be true next year, and we know they're true this year. The world has changed, and the needs of kids have gone up dramatically, and the funds are not going to go up dramatically. So in many ways, we're either going to do less of the same, or we're going to have to do more of something different. And I think that could be the kind of motivation we need. Certainly, as I look at what are the kinds of innovations we want to be looking at, many of them circle back to the kinds of things that Paolo was mentioning around some of our most vulnerable students. If you take a look at, say, kids with special needs, this might be the time where we really do shift far more instruction away from lower skilled paraprofessionals to higher skilled teachers, or that army of tutors that might be retired teachers that we want to bring in. I think that what we know most about education is that the teacher matters, and really focusing on the human capital side of K-12, expanding the pool, whether it's alternative certification. We know we lost a lot of teachers to retirement this year. So I think that the necessity of kids, the importance of teachers, and this financial crunch might actually be the very crucible to get some of these good changes to happen. That's the optimistic side of me.
I appreciate that optimism. It goes into a question we're getting from the audience. How do we know that we're going to have budget cuts, and what are we anticipating as though the cost? We know that COVID didn't start this crisis, and so across our country, because of the way that we've set up funding for schools, whether that be based on sales tax or property taxes, those things are going to be impacted agnostic of what happens with us getting a vaccine going forward. So can you all share a little bit around why are we saying or anticipating that there potentially would be cuts, and what are you thinking about the projection of where budgets are going to fall next year? And I'll open it up to the group.
Yeah, and I can start. Again, I keep a very close contact with the state budget office. And of all the times I've seen in my history in state government, this is probably the most uncertainty that there's ever been. I think, I even tell people 6 months ago, I was saying, certainly by fall, by winter, we'll have a clear sense. There'll be more stability, and we are even more unstable than we were before. The prospect of a vaccine, I think, is exciting and very creates a lot of hope, and I think that's a good thing. But right now, the Ohio State Budget Office is sitting there preparing the governor's budget proposal that's going to be introduced to the legislature in early January, and I'm struggling to understand how they're even trying to project state revenues for a 2-year budget period, and certainly it'll go through different iterations. So the counter to that is most school treasurers in Ohio are playing it very conservative. They're in some ways assuming the worst, which means they're kind of really being tight about any new or optional kinds of spending. They're looking at their reserves very carefully. They're every decision is being scrutinized to the nth degree, and I think that's justifiable in the context in which those men and women operate, especially given the uncertainty in the budget. The other thing that I think I have to remind people is that education is such a large portion of every state's budget that even a modest blip on the radar screen, it's hard to avoid reductions to education. Now, one of the things we've seen in the past is the federal government comes in and acts as a buffer to try to smooth over some of what might likely be larger budget reductions, and it's still unclear to what extent federal stimulus activity is going to play that role. So you've got a lot of these uncertain factors, and I think the right posture for schools and districts is to again be really conservative in some of the assumptions that they're making and the choices that they're making, and to Nate's point, continue to look for ways to maybe even bring costs down in certain areas where there might be cost savings to be had.
I think if I could jump in and follow up on that, the other thing that I think about is what I call scenario planning. There are a couple scenarios. The floor might fall out in tax revenues, and there'll be a very slow recovery, and that's going to lead to cuts, and that will stink. Or maybe there's a scenario in which the feds come to our rescue. If history is a guide, maybe it's just for a year. It's a one shot. It pushes the problem off. But in both cases, time is our friend. Time for planning. One of the lessons. I remember the ARA funds coming, and yet it was really nice in the Great Recession that we got this money. Well, two things happened. One, it came on such short notice that we misspent. Just a ton of it because we didn't have enough time to plan. And, hiring cycles are 6 months out from when the money came. The same thing is true if the money's not coming. You don't get to say, oh, I wouldn't have hired these folks if I knew I wasn't going to have the money. So I think if you wait until we know for sure exactly whether we're cutting, staying whole, or even adding, if we wait till we know that, we will not make good decisions because it takes so long to plan. And so as painful as it is, I think we need to be preparing for cuts. We need to be preparing for an infusion of money. And then let's hope you get the better of those outcomes. But I don't think you can wait.
Nate, I appreciate that. When we talk a little bit more around what we think the Fed role should be and how we think they should play. So most of us across the country have been talking about like, hey, there might be another CARES Act, and we anticipate if there is that there may be an education portion to that. How should we think about, should those dollars come with strings to states to where they say, like, if you receive these dollars, you should use them? Then I'll add a part B. What are the lessons that we can learn from how we use the first round of CARES and the pandemic, the PPP dollars, to be able to make sure that we're making the greatest impact with those funds? And that's to the group.
Sure. A couple thoughts on that front. So one is duration matters and certainty of duration. School districts don't spend or turn on a dime. So giving people a lot of money on short notice is not nearly as helpful as giving us a lot more notice. But also the duration, saying, hey, we're going to do this over 2 or 3 years. You can plan and spread it out. What ended up happening, certainly to me, an important lesson from the Great Recession, was the money was very welcome. It's about $100 billion, but it was presented as 1 year money, which meant I had to spend $100 billion in a year, which wasn't hard to do, but it was hard to do wisely. It meant that I was really not comfortable hiring as many teachers because how do I pay for them next year? So I bought a lot of stuff. Had they simply said, hey, here's $100 billion and you can take 2 years or 3 years to spend it. Now, some districts will say, I can't wait. That's fine. But others would have said, I'd rather a lot of teachers and tutors and interventionists, and I know I can hire them for 3 years, I'll do that. So giving districts some time to spend the money is helpful. I think the other part of your question, Kenya, is, how many strings should be attached? And I'm of mixed minds. It is smart people can think about smart ways to spend the money. And yet by the time it finally translates through the states and down to the districts, having been on the receiving end of that, I'm a little more cynical. And I think that giving districts a fair amount of flexibility, perhaps with heightened accountability, is a better route than trying to figure out at the federal level exactly how these dollars should go. And as rural districts, urban districts, large districts, small districts may have very different needs as well.
I want to echo that. Just as the kind of charter, with my charter hat on, I'm always going to advocate for maximum flexibility. But I do think that kind of continuity and the timing and making sure that this is kind of longer lasting. We have no idea what the long-term impact, once we're all vaccinated and we go back to whatever life is normal looks like. There are going to be long-term impacts of this. We're going to have students in schools that have lost family members, that have faced adults losing jobs, the mental health supports that are going to be in place. There's also been wildfires across the West Coast and the murder of George Floyd, and our communities are dealing with a lot in this context. And so I think, the needs of districts and charters are so diverse. But I do think giving people that time to plan and be thoughtful will make sure that that money is going where it's going to have the most impact.
When we're thinking about how to prep, Paolo, you talked about how Ohio's in a 2-year budget cycle and they're trying to plan out. I can't plan to January, so I'm really excited that they are so advanced at that. But how can advocates who are on the ground or leaders in districts really understand how states are doing their budgeting process, and how can they track how cuts are going to happen? And what do each of you all recommend, and how should they be engaging their community in preparing for these potential budget cuts or the budget needs?
So, I mean, again, I'll start a little bit. Budgets don't necessarily have to be mysterious things. A lot of people are intimidated by them, but, find out who actually leads the budget activity. Sometimes it's a state budget office, but there's usually also a companion legislative budget office of some kind. The thing to try to get a hold of is looking at economic forecasts, and a lot of those are very public in terms of what people are predicting might happen to the state revenue scenario. If you had a budget reduction session in the last legislative session, what were the long-term forecasts that were being floated at that particular time that might give you some insight, and then it becomes a matter of strategizing. I think to me, the advice I give to advocates is help people see the value. How can people see the value of what it is that you're espousing in the context of the pandemic and all its related fallout? Because to me, the granular budget decision makers at the district level are at the end of the day going to try to invest their monies in those things that are likely to have the greatest impact. And so the more you can do to make the case of that impact, a lot of the dollars, when they're coming, most of the, huge chunks of money flow from the state without regard to any particular initiative or what have you. It goes just as general subsidy. The crux is what's happening at the district level in terms of the priorities and the choices that they make. And that's where I think the rubber meets the road from an advocacy perspective.
One of the things that one of the themes I think we're hearing today is the need to really plan and be thoughtful in advance. Even though there's uncertainty, it's the kind of modeling that Nate was talking about. And that really means not having things done at the last minute in a closed door. It means really reaching out to stakeholders who are going to be impacted and not letting them know as far in advance that there are these possibilities and working with them. That's one of the principles that we develop with these other organizations. And it's one of the things that it's a tough thing for a state to decide, are we doing a good job in unprecedented time to really reach out to stakeholders and listen to them? And that's one of the reasons why we have these principles, but we really want states to think hard about how are they doing with these principles. If there's 10 of them, are there 5 that they're really doing well with and 5 that they could be working with? And the stakeholder engagement could be one of those. And that's one of the reasons why we developed a diagnostic tool, which we can put online for advocates and state policymakers to use. And it's a series of yes, no questions. You know, how far in advance are you engaging stakeholders? Are you requiring districts to be equitable when they pass on their cuts? It's that series of yes, no questions. And then at the end of the diagnostic, it says, which of the principles is a state already doing great on, just needs to continue doing what it's doing, and which of the principles does it need to do some work on? And here are some very specific recommendations on how a state could do that. And I think that that's online, and then ExcelinEd is happy to kind of work with states and partners who are interested in using that diagnostic and even considering some of the recommendations made, because at the end of the day, the principles are great at a high level, but everything is going to be very state specific. It's going to be different for Ohio. It's going to be different for Tennessee or Florida. And we want states to think through, like, how do they take into account their own individual finances and needs over the next couple of years.
Nate, you've talked a lot around flexibility and agency. And Emily, you highlighted, like, if you got a choice, you're going to choose flexible over anything. But how do we have some real accountability around the dollars and what we want to see? And then how do we make sure that time isn't an enemy? From Marguerite says, like, she made a note that in Seattle schools is only serving 1 student in person right now. I think we have varying community contexts and how people are being impacted by the virus and how we're thinking about education. What do you recommend, one, from the accountability perspective, and then also how do we make sure that we're not stagnant going forward?
Sure, a number of really good questions there. I think on the accountability side, there are a few things. Again, I do advocate generally for some flexibility, but the flexibility is along how you spend the dollars, and the accountability should be on, I think, 2 different levels. One is around what are the results you're getting, which I do think put some pressure. And this may not be popular to everybody in America, particularly in K-12, but maintaining some level of state testing, perhaps less, probably less, but I've noticed that a lot of districts in their own internal testing have cut way back. And again, I understand to some degree, but if we stop assessing how kids are learning, how much they're learning and which groups of kids are learning, which groups of kids are falling much further behind, I don't know how you can say the dollars are being used well. And I think historically, this kind of data has been a wake-up call. So we are hypothesizing that lots of kids are falling behind, but you really need to know which kids and which groups so you can take action. I think there's another area that is a little more input-driven, and that is around equity. I mean, I think we have come to a place in American K-12 where almost everybody is for equity in theory, but far less so in practice. And generally, equity is, I think about funding. So I say we need to spend more money in the schools that have more vulnerable students, period. Before the pandemic, we were not doing that in most districts and in most states. And with less money, if we're not really proactive about it, I think it is more likely we're going to do worse than better as far as funding the schools and the districts that have the greatest needs. And so that is an input-oriented accountability measure. And I think there are a couple things states can do to help make that happen. One is, and I want to preface all of this, is I believe that many, many districts want to be far more equitable in their spending, want to put more dollars into schools with more vulnerable kids, but it's very hard to do politically. So I just want to put that out there, that the will is far greater than the ability, at least from what I see across the country. So what states can do to help people do the things we want them to do and they want to do, one is they can provide political cover. And by that I mean just say loudly and regularly, this is the right thing to do. We need to put more money into serving and supporting kids with greater needs. And yes, that will require shifting from one school to another. I think they can provide objective data beyond just the bully pulpit, and to really help communities and districts know just how inequitable they are. And I think too often you say, hey, this has 20 teachers and that school has 20 teachers, so it's reasonable. So I do think the data systems are starting to be developed, but really shining a light on how much inequity there is will help supercharge folks who already want to do this and perhaps some who don't. And then lastly, as we think about accountability systems, and they've been evolving at the state level, many of them are going well beyond just math, reading, science, and social studies scores. It seems reasonable to me that having an accountability measure for districts that looks at the equity of spending, even if there were not dramatic repercussions right away, just by adding it to the accountability system, makes people know it's important, and I think gives the clout to superintendents and school boards who have wanted to do this for a while, but can actually point to the state as the big, bad, ugly state who's making us do the very thing we wanted to do. So, few thoughts on that front.
I want to build a little bit on what Nate said, because I think we need to be careful not to fall into the fallacy that simply spending more money will result in either closing the gap or meeting the needs. Because far too many times, and this precedes the pandemic, there are examples where districts and schools, were not using their available resources as effectively as possible. I point to Ohio's recent initiatives on improving literacy outcomes, and so many times, I'm a collector of stories about improvement, and I hear these stories saying, it finally dawned on us we had a curriculum alignment problem, that we really weren't teaching our kids what the standards were saying they needed. We began to dig in. We made some adjustments that were fairly modest. Our teachers were a little bit skeptical about whether their students could actually do the kinds of things that we were saying they needed to be doing, but they finally found out that they could. And then a lot of energy developed, and our reading test scores went up with very modest amounts of investment. So I think we need to. I think one of the challenges to the current accountability system is we'll point out at the back end from the outcome perspective what isn't happening, but we really don't focus very much on what are the best practices that you can put into place, and how do we ensure and hold districts accountable for identifying and pushing those best practices as outcomes. More work around high quality instructional materials, more work around highly impactful literacy programs, a multi-tiered system of supports that identify specific student needs and provide those in very direct and personalized ways. A whole host of things that demonstrate to me that resources, if there are additional ones, will be used effectively and will in fact make a difference for the educational outcomes for students. We spend a lot of time designing these judgment systems, but then, and we assume people know, but I think what we're finding is we need to focus more on high quality practices to actually make a result happen.
Yeah, if I could just double down on that one, and even an amen to that, because I do think that when dollars are short, and potentially they will be, I think two bad things happen and one good thing should. So the first is we focus, and I'll admit, we fell into this trap ourselves. We have talked a lot about how much money are we going to have. So when dollars are short, we talk a lot about how much we're going to get. And second, we can use that, at least subconsciously, as an excuse for why we can't get better, why innovation doesn't often happen during downturns in K-12, but it tends to happen in other sectors during downturns. And I think all of that leads to really what Paolo was saying. How we spend money still will matter more than how much money we spend. And if dollars are short, putting more emphasis on what I sometimes refer to as academic return on investment, knowing what is working. I mean, let's face it, we've known what works in elementary literacy for 20 years, and our studies say fewer than 5 or 10% of the elementary schools in America are doing it today. Yeah. And that doesn't cost more money. And so I think turning the conversation during an economic downturn to academic return on investment, to best practices, to cost-effective practices, has to be half the equation, half the discussion. Because if it's just about how much money we have and who gets it, I don't think we're going to see the outcomes we want. But thanks for that reminder.
This is a great conversation. It kind of reminds me that this is really an opportunity to kind of for states to really restructure if they want to and move away from the inputs. The inputs now are you fund based on the number of students you have physically present in your building. And of course, we know that's not happening in most states. So they've kind of shifted to alternatives like logins to a computer, which aren't really meaningful inputs or measures of engagement. And that gets to Marguerite's point. I mean, are we really incentivizing districts to reach out to the students who have disappeared, to the students who aren't really engaged? And are we shifting from an input to more of an output, at least with some of the money? At least make some of the money attached to how well are districts doing engaging and educating students. That would be an amazing silver lining in all of this if we could kind of shift and give the flexibility, but the accountability that we've been talking about today.
When we think about this from a long-term way on how we should be addressing funding, I'm going to start with Emily on this question. What do you want policymakers to think about differently? And then ask all the rest of the panelists to chime in on how do we address our funding inequities going forward?
Yeah, so I'm always going to have my charter hat on, and that's we must, and I referenced this earlier. This is a pre-pandemic condition: is that charter schools get on average about 80% of what district schools do, and there's a value judgment there that if a parent makes a decision to send their child to a charter school, then that child is somehow worth less, and we just can't. That can't continue. And so there has to be a lot of state level conversations about, what do our funding streams look like? Are we making sure that money is going where it is most needed? Because charter schools serve predominantly Black, Brown, and students from low-income communities. And so I think we really have to reflect on that gap. So that would be kind of my charge to policymakers going forward as we're thinking about really revamping how we're funding public education. That's something I think we need to lean into.
Paolo, Nate, and Matthew, are there ways, what do you think that we should be doing long-term to fix educational funding?
So that's a great question. And I think there are plenty of structural issues that continue to be a challenge to that, to the point where in some ways I've given up. I tell people I'm a recovering school funding, practitioner, because, as much as we try and as much as we look at other states, try to, get to more, equity in terms of the distribution of funds, people will find ways, especially people of means will find ways for their experiences to be better. So, which is why a lot of times I come back to sort of the fundamentals. And I tip my hat. I sent both my kids to charter high school, after sending them for 8 years to a urban public traditional school system. So I love, I know great educations can be found in big city urban school districts, and great educations can be found in charter schools. And to me, what is my standard bearer is quality. I'm looking for quality. And I think this is maybe where we spend a lot of time looking at the funding issues, when in fact, the more we can do to support improvement. What does a really committed improvement context look like in a school? And I tip my hat when I see it in traditional public school districts, and I tip my hat when I see it in charter schools and in private schools. And sometimes I don't see it enough as I'd like to, but those entities that have a strong culture of improvement and are committed to that, and if we can help people more understand what that looks like, how to actually make a difference, how to really use formative assessment data to drive decision-making about educational practice that really results in closing gaps and helping students reach higher levels of accomplishment, I think that's needs a lot of attention. I don't say that because I want a lot of money flowing to State Department. Some people would accuse me of that because, frankly, I think the education community as a whole needs to hold itself accountable for helping each other out. You know, places that already have good practices in place. We see a lot of this in some ways more among the charter school community than we do necessarily in the traditional public school community. How do we together work to drive greater improvement in those places and make people realize, saying, hey, look, your literacy approach is outdated, or your Title I approach is outdated, or what have you. Because in the end, even though there may still be differentials in funding, you'll still maximize what you're able to do with the dollars. And frankly, you can do a lot more with the dollars that you already have and be positioned to use the additional dollars that might be coming to you in a more effective way.
One of the things that's really come up in the pandemic is that, you know, parents want to have the opportunity. They don't want to feel locked in. You know, if their district is not providing in-person instruction and there's another district or charter school that is, they might want to switch there. And parents all over the country are doing that, but our funding system is not designed to really make that easy. Parents oftentimes have to like leave a big portion of the funding that's associated with their child behind, you know, that the district that's not serving the student anymore gets to keep it, and the district that is serving, or the charter school is serving, only gets a fraction of it. And that's one of the restructures that a state can do. They can do what we call student-centered or backpack funding, where that full amount of money goes with the student if the parent chooses to switch. And of course, we want to have that backpack to be larger for vulnerable students so that the district or charter school serving that student has the extra resources to provide to that student. That would be a radical change, because in most states, only a fraction of funding is student-centered.
Yeah, I think one other thought is to take particularly what's been said, but to really give it a narrow focus. My feeling is that for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, we will have more struggling students than ever before. We are going to need, you know, dramatic amounts of acceleration and dramatic amounts of intervention. We need to catch a lot of kids up, especially in their ability to read, their ability to comprehend, to think critically in a relatively narrow range of foundational skills. And that says, so how do we not just shift and fund those efforts, but only the ones that are working? And I think there are 2 ways of thinking about what's working. There's one, what I'll call the John Hattie way, in which is the research says some things are a lot more effective on average than others. You know, highly skilled reading teachers and highly skilled teachers in general versus, say, paraprofessionals or even smaller class sizes. So the first is making sure there's nothing in our funding rules that make it harder to do the best practices or easier to do the worst practices. And there are a lot of those rules in place already. But then the next level is, for every dollar we're spending, even if you spend it in a way that has worked elsewhere, that is no guarantee it's working in your school system. And that is having this really robust academic return on investment, this program evaluation skills. And I will point out a shout out to my friends in Massachusetts, where the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has worked with about 45 districts to build their capacity to measure what's working, so that even if they're doing the right stuff, if it's not working, they will know that and can take steps. So I think we have to fund what works, but then actually be able to measure at a school and district level if it is actually working. And that's going to make every dollar we have a lot more impactful and a lot more learning.
I think 2 other things I'll mention, just because I think we're saying in the context of additional resources, early childhood education, we still should invest more there, because it's you know, very well shown that it has a demonstrable impact. And I think, frankly, more time, fund either more robust activities and learning opportunities over the summer, or extending the school day, the school year. I think that can bear a lot of fruit as well.
Thank you all. I'm going to ask a closing question and for you to target, if you want to give a grassroots response of telling, if you had one thing to say to your communities around funding, what would you want to share them? Or you can give a grass top, where we are about to have a transition at the federal level. What would be the one thing that you'd want to share? So you can give a grassroots response or a grass tops response. So what's the one thing you would tell either of those bodies, and you get to choose?
I'll send a message to the incoming administration that I'd like them to listen to parents. Just that parents should have a seat at the table as well, and that choice is important.
At least for me, on the grassroots side, it is not that helpful to simply fight for every dollar you used to have, because the people you're arguing with don't have the dollars more often than not. And I think the real question is particularly at the grassroots level, how do we get to the same or even better outcomes in a world of less dollars? So we need to think differently. We don't want to cut services or cut and certainly lower outcomes, but we are going to have to do it differently. And if the grassroots folks can actually help think through what is a different but better path to a great end, I think it's going to be more constructive and a better outcome.
I guess what I would tell people is they need to work to better understand the policy tensions that exist. And I'll just to illustrate that simply, on the one hand, our schools need more money. On the other hand, taxes are too high, or I'm not willing to support additional taxes. Because at the end of the day, it's very challenging to reconcile those two perspectives. And it creates a policy challenge. It's very challenging to governors and legislators and others to try to rectify and resolve, as well as for the general public to try to resolve. So understand how different policy areas interweave and think about that in the context of what it is you're trying to accomplish.
And I would add that, that involving teachers, consulting teachers at the earliest stage. I mean, they're the ones who might be able to give great advice on, if there's going to be a cut, how can this be done that my students are harmed the least? And I think that's one of the principles we have, is that states themselves need to make sure they're consulting with key stakeholders like teachers and parents, and require districts to do it when they're thinking about their cuts. That's the way I think we can make sure that when it's actually implemented in the classroom, it's not going to harm as much. And there's also a tremendous amount of community members out there who could be helping stretch the dollars. And we've mentioned like tutors. We have recent college graduates who can't get jobs right now. We have all kinds of retired people that Nate mentioned. We have people who have been laid off who could come in and help with counseling and tutoring and instruction, and sometimes might require lifting some of these state restrictions on what a district can do. What can they do, at least in the short term, in terms of bringing people into the building and expanding who can be a counselor, who can be a tutor. I think by involving all of these community members who really probably want to help right now, we can stretch the dollars and make sure that we're not hurting students any more than is necessary.
Panelists, I'd like to thank you all for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. And to our audience members, would like to thank you all for attending. As you all leave this session, what I hope you are left with is being inspired around, we have opportunities to be able to plan early and think about how we support all of our students and how we prioritize our most vulnerable, and think about how we work in collaboration. The one thing that COVID has taught me, because I'm trying to think of positive lessons around this, is that community is extremely important. And so how are you thinking about engaging your community more robustly? And then lastly, there is no option of going back to the way things were. And so how do you think proactively about how do we imagine a new way forward? Thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoy the day, and I hope you enjoy the session. Have a great day.